Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Audrey Stewart, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to welcome you to today's event with Salamishah Tillet discussing her new book, In Search of the Color Purple, The Story of an American Masterpiece. She is joined in conversation today by Régine Jean-Charles. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our new digital community during these challenging times. Our spring season is in full swing, so make sure to check out our event schedule on harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk tonight, go to the Q&A button on your screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. If you'd like to purchase a copy of In Search of the Color Purple, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you, especially during this difficult time for community spaces like your local bookstore. There will also be a link for donation in the chat if you'd like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Your purchases and financial contributions make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever supports the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you for tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings this past year, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as we can, so thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Now I am so pleased to introduce two powerhouse women. Salamishah Tillet is a scholar, cultural critic, and activist. She's a professor at Rutgers University, Newark, and previously a professor of English and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Salamishah is a contributing critic at large for the New York Times and a co-founder of A Long Walk Home, which is a Chicago-based national nonprofit that uses art to empower youth to end violence against girls and women. She's also joined by Régine Jean-Charles, who is a feminist literary scholar and activist who has been working on issues surrounding rape culture for the past 20 years. She's currently an associate professor of French and African Diaspora studies at Boston College. She is the author of multiple books, including Conflict Bodies, The Politics of Rape Representation, and the Francophone Imagination. Tonight, they are discussing In Search of the Color Purple. Salamishah's book explores this groundbreaking, historic, Pulitzer Prize-winning novel through cultural criticism, history, and memoir. And I'll leave you with this quote from Anita Hill. In Search of the Color Purple delivers extraordinary insight into both the love and the struggle that made Miss Walker's exquisitely crafted novel a masterpiece. After reading Salamishah Tillet's opponent book, neither reader nor writer will forget that it takes courage and audacity to write a novel that tells the reality of women's lives. And on that note of extreme praise, I'll turn things over to our authors. Salamishah, Régine, thank you so much for joining us this evening. The virtual podium is yours.
Thank you, Audrey, and thank you for all who are in attendance here. I'm so blessed and honored to be in conversation with Dr. Jean-Charles and also to be here at the Harvard Bookstore. Régine and I are both graduates of Harvard. We received our PhDs there. And so we spent countless hours going through the books and sitting and attending talks. And so it just feels like both a rites of passage and coming of onto our own as scholars and as feminists and as friends. I just feel really blessed to be here, so thank you. I'm going to read an excerpt prompted by Régine. I'm actually going to read a new piece, a new excerpt tonight. I haven't read this part yet. And it's at the end of the book, and it's about the musical. So my book covers the making of the novel, the making of the movie, and then the musical itself. And I kind of tell the kind of large story of The Color Purple in the American cultural imagination. And so I will begin here. I'm just gonna do my here we go. So, and this is about the second version of the musical, the one that won the Tony Award in 2015. So 2 months after Me Too went viral in 2018, I thought that the musical minimized the sexual trauma that Celie endured. Unlike the book or even the movie, the Color Purple musical has always started with Celie's description of her stepfather's raping of her and then jumps quickly to the birth of her children. In the Broadway original, the one that came out in 2005, a chorus of women humorously chant, "Who the daddy?" And in the revival, a bedsheet is used for that scene. As I sat there this time, I was annoyed by the muting of first Pa's and then Mister's violence, wondering if the story that had so graphically and realistically retold the horror of sexual violence, Celie's, and my own, was now lost in the very moment of Me Too that it helped birth. At the end of the evening, the mainly white crowd stood roaring with relief and appreciation. I, however, clapped begrudgingly, feeling that somehow the Color Purple had betrayed me and the Me Too movement before us. I held on to that feeling for a long time and wondered if the Color Purple had peaked in its message, or at least in its most ubiquitous form as a musical, had lost its edge in our age of disclosure and newfound accountability. The audiences whom I saw the show with were mainly late baby boomers, for whom Walker's original story might still seem startling, but I imagine that would not be the case for millennials, for whom gender and sexual fluidity are not abstract concepts, but often a hard-fought reality of their lives and self-fashioning. To test out my theory, that summer, I hosted a series of conversations with high school girls about to leave for college, who had read Walker's novel when they were in middle school or early high school, but had not seen either the movie or the musical. These girls were introduced to me by their mothers or teachers, Black and white women who had read The Color Purple as their own rites of passage, but did not feel it necessary to discuss it with their daughters. In one such gathering, Edie, a white 18-year-old graduate from Brooklyn on the eve of her matriculation to Yale, told me that what had always stood out to her was what Scott Sanders, the producer of the musicals, said drew him to the story as well. Walker's radical rendering of Celie forgiving Albert. In the age of Me Too, if you're just hearing Celie's story being told in the musical, it would be hard to get on board with forgiving Mister, because what he did was so awful. I think in the novel, because of the way it's written and because of who Celie is, it's less difficult than it would be, Eddie says to us. I found in the discussions that I have with people now, where I try to introduce complexity, people are afraid of it because no one knows how to deal. What if you have this relationship with this man, even though he's done all these things? She concluded, I think overall Me Too is doing an amazing thing because it's bringing to light a system of oppression that was pushed under the rug in so many professions. I also think because now that all these terrible things have been exposed, no one knows how to deal with those gray areas and the middle ground. I think that's why the novel is important now. Admitting that I really hadn't thought much of what Albert, rather than the triad of Walker's women, Celie, Shug, and Sophia, who had inspired me, meant in the age of Me Too, I left slightly bewildered and amused. Maybe I was wrong about the musical, and Mister, after all. Seeing the musical again for the fourth time, I mainly paid attention to Albert, a figure who often recedes in the background despite being the progenitor of so much harm and heartbreak in Celie's life. When Shug and Celie leave him, his descent into madness is swift and relentless, enabling us to better visualize Walker's severe critique of patriarchy and Albert's reliance on it than we could with the novel or the movie. Just as Sophia and Harper are the love story that we most cheer for, Albert, next to Celie, is the character whose transformation is the most far-reaching and thus most utopian. In his final scene alone at a picnic with Celie, Albert misreads Celie's affection and tolerance for him and even proposes to her. And though I laughed at Albert's naivete here, his tenderness and his transformation are real. Sharing a seashell with Celie, Albert tells her of his unfulfilled dreams of seeing the ocean. And while in the novel, Walker wrote, "The more I wonder, the more I love," the musical's subtle change to the more pluralistic, "the more us wonder, the more us love," marks Albert's newfound communion with Celie, with his family, and perhaps even with God herself. Albert gets his redemption and he does something, Jonathan Doyle, the director of the Tony Award-winning musical, says to me. He does things for the children of the community, and maybe that's all a little through a pink gauze. But there's something wonderful about that. It's not to forgive, mister, but it's hard to break how you were raised. And of course, that violence, as you know, really comes out of slavery. This time, as I watched Albert evolve and develop on stage, I wondered if Edie was right. I've long fantasized about the moment when the men who raped me asked for my forgiveness. I've replayed the scene so many times, a sudden phone call, a random Facebook message, or even an old school letter replaying the night of my attack from my vantage point, but now in their own words. Occasionally, I've tried to trace the fates of my assailants. The first, now a doctor living in Texas. The second, whose last name I'm not entirely certain of, whose face is partly receded from my memory, to see if their single act against my body has shaped their lives as much as it has shaped mine. In my make-believe scenario, their apologies come with weeping, mine and theirs, for taking so much from me for so long. Their long overdue confession delivered, and somehow my closure is complete. The reality, however, is that like most rape survivors, I'm likely to never have such an opportunity. As such, I have time and time again learned to fill my own voids and violations with a tenderness that I've made for myself and have found in others. In lieu of such accountability for my trauma, I have Mr. But he, more than any of Walker's characters from The Color Purple, though inspired by her grandfather, remains completely fictional to me. This is not because I do not believe in Albert's redemption. It is because after millions of survivors of sexual harassment and sexual assault have come forward in the past few years, the legal consequences have only impacted a couple of powerful men, like Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby, while scores of others like Matt Lauer, Louis C.K., and Al Franken have experienced career humiliation. Against that backdrop, Albert's atonement appears even more subversive and elusive because he embarks on the journey knowing that such a promising ending is neither simple nor guaranteed. Instead of playing the victim, Albert owns his violence and the harm that he has caused. In the last moments of the musical The Color Purple, Alice saw an ending on the Broadway stage that she always wanted on screen. Albert, not set apart and forced to watch his family gathered together without him, but standing firmly with the blended family he helped reunite. He is not a hero. That status belongs to Celie, Shug, and Sophia. But his atonement is the wish fulfillment of every rape survivor that I've ever met. In this way, Walker's novel still remains far ahead of its time and ours. For while most of us survivors will never hear such an apology or benefit from such restitution, I now look to Albert for what could be rather than what was for me.
Thank you.
Thanks for choosing that one. I haven't read it, so.
I think that was the first time I ugly cried. I definitely teared up earlier, but that was the first time I ugly cried while reading. And there's just so much there that I think really captures your journey. And before I delve into my questions, I just want to thank you. I really can't think of a better day to have this conversation with you than on March 1st, right? We just ended Black History Month and we're starting Women's History Month. And of course, when we consider Alice Walker's commitment to the intersections of racial justice and gender justice, as well as your own, this is the perfect day to have this conversation. So thank you, and thank you for writing this book. Thank you for dedicating it to A Long Walk Home. Thank you for the care that you brought to Alice's words, her life, her work. I have so many questions and I'm so excited to talk to you about this. So because I have so many questions, I organize them around themes. And I think I told you this before, but I organize them around themes. And I want to start with that passage actually, and this theme of the journey, which I feel is everywhere in this book, right? You know, I really feel that the Color Purple, which, you know, we both teach it a lot and we both know that it's a Black feminist Bible, it offers a template for a survivor journey. And I know that so much of your own writing in the aftermath of your own sexual assault, and in fact, in the first few pages, you share that poem from Story of a Rape Survivor, Do You Know What Rape Feels Like? we see that journey, right? But it's not only, I mean, it is the journey of your healing, but I also see all these other journeys, like Alice's journey as a writer, the journey of The Color Purple, from the people in her family to the book, the journey from the novel to the film to the musical, right? And your healing journey, of course, but also your journey as a writer, right? Which I kind of see even that evolution in here. And of course, even your journey of the vantage point from how you see Albert, which is so beautifully captured in that passage. Could you just talk about all of those different journeys, or the multiple journeys that you embarked on in writing this book?
No, thank you, Regine. And I hope we continue to talk about our mutual, not just our affection for each other, but the way in which our activism around ending violence against women is such a foundation for our relationship and our sisterhood as well. I was actually thinking, when I'm working on this other book on Nina Simone, and a while ago I was on a panel with Rebecca Mead, who's a journalist of the New Yorker, and she wrote a book, My Life in Middlemarch, on George Eliot's Middlemarch, and she gave me a really useful way of framing the book. She said that she knew each chapter had to have an arc of Middlemarch, an arc of Eliot, and her arc, right? And so I think I was aware of that. I think sometimes different chapters in the book, I'm more present, I'm less present, Alice is more present. But I knew that there were in some ways, 4 stories I was trying to tell. My coming of age, Celie's coming of age, the novel's coming of age, and Alice's coming of age. Alice's is coming of age is primarily in the first part of the book. And then The Color Purple at large keeps on coming and growing into its own throughout the book itself. So I knew that. And I think part of the journeys also was just reading Alice's own. She writes a lot about The Color Purple, and she has a whole book about the movie and her experience with the movie. She's written many essays about, she has one essay about when the idea came to her. She has other essays about the controversy. So I was able to kind of understand her process enough to be able to try to retell it to you all in my own voice. So I think that's part of the reason there's so many. And then also just land is so important to Walker. In The Color Purple, land is really important to all of the people that Celie, they live on, they're not sharecroppers, but they live in the shadow of sharecroppers. They own the land that they're on, but they're free Black people who are living on land that they own. So that's important to her. Alice grew up as a sharecropper's daughter, and then she has to move to California for the characters to come to her. So this idea of land and journeys, I think, is also integral to the story of The Color Purple, the novel, but also Alice's journey as a writer, and then me finding her. So there's all these ways, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, don't be sorry. I love it. It's so exciting. In full disclosure, family came into the room also, and I had to
I saw you like muting. I was like, she's talking to someone, but it's not me. It's cool.
And then she saw you like, it's Auntie Salamishah. Anyway, all right. So yes, okay. So I love that, and it's so layered, and all of it comes through. And I definitely think I see that. And I love that you said also thinking about, because it also fits with A Long Walk Home, right? And so even the idea, like A Long Walk Home itself is about this journey from the victim to survivor. And so at one point you say, you talk about The Color Purple as, quote, offering a model for healing and transformation from oppressed subjects to empowered citizen, right? And how The Color Purple has offered that for a generation of women, right? Yourself, Tarana Burke, Aisha Shaida Simmons. And to me, I read that and I was like, that sounds a lot like the theory of change for A Long Walk Home, right? And so I wanted you to just talk a little bit about that connection. You do mention it throughout the book. And of course, you dedicate the book to A Long Walk Home. But I wanted to hear more about that robust relationship in between your healing and the organization and In Search of the Color Purple and The Color Purple.
Yeah, well, I think in terms of the home part, I mean, so I would say that I don't have the original copy of The Color Purple here. It's in my dining room, but there's a house on the cover of the first edition of The Color Purple. And then when Alice read my version, she asked to read the version before it went to final proofs. And we have a house on this one as well. She asked to make sure there was a tree or a flower. So that was her addition to the to the cover. And so what I think I'd like to talk about the home on 3 different levels. So one, just on the cover, but also the kind of home that is so, if you watch the movie, it's so important. The home that so much of the violence, but also potential healing takes place, right? Celie ends up having her own home and owning land. In the musical, the home is the backdrop of the set. So there's, again, this relationship to land and owning home. And I start the book off at Alice's home. And she lives on 40 acres of land. And so she's found a resting place, as she says.
And you
there.
end that other home also, not to spoil it for people, but the other, the home in Georgia, right?
Exactly. She goes back home.
Yeah.
And she buys her own home for the first time in Georgia. Around the time of her 75th birthday. So there's the home that's important to Alice, that's on the cover of the book. There's a Long Walk Home, our organization, and the name of it comes from a poem that I wrote on my walk home after being sexually assaulted when I was on a study abroad program in Kenya. And my sister, as she was documenting my healing process, went through my journal and asked if she could see my journal, and I shared it with her, and she found a poem called The Walk Home. And so that journey to recovery and that journey to self, and then did you come up with the name? Did you come up with the Long Walk Home? Yeah. No. Okay, I know you came up with swords. Okay, so we came up with the Long Walk Home. Yeah, so I think the idea of the returning to home as a safe space, even though it's also a potential too often site of violation, is really like a Black feminist epistemology, as we say in the academy, but let's say a Black feminist way of imagining the world, right? And so the home, and what I think was so magnificent about Black feminism and this relation, and this comes from feminism, but I think Black women take it to another level, the relationship between the home as a site of potential healing, but also common harm, and then the state as a site of harm and hopefully potential justice. And so that movement between the state, the nation state, and the country, and our physical homes is really at the crux of Black feminism, where the private and the public and the political and the intimate are all these things that are being understood at once. And I think what made The Color Purple so controversial was that Alice Walker was amongst a group of women who were spotlighting these private violences and making them public, making the home the space in which we were going to negotiate racial identity, sexuality, and community. So yeah, I think it operates for me on many levels, but I think it also, as you point out, operates for the book. And then our organizational Long Walk Home really is birthed through this journey of sisterhood, but also this journey of healing and hope after trauma, after my trauma in particular. But now, there's so many people who've shared their stories with us and who have healed and found their voice through organizing and attending therapy and creating art. That's the crux of A Long Walk Home. Those 3 pillars of art as activism, art as expression, and art as a place of healing to facilitate healing.
I love that the way that you just talked about Alice's use of the home and the way that she's using that to interrogate the different violences that are meted out against Black women. And it reminds me of, in the afterword, right, the wonderful quotations that Beverly Guy-Sheftall uses in Words of Fire from her essay, right, when she talks about, oh my gosh, it's just so devastating. But she, when she knew what Malcolm was saying when he said freedom by any means necessary, right? And then Alice says, it's nearly crushing to realize there was an assumption on anyone's part that Black women would fight injustice except when the foe was white, right? And yeah, would not fight injustice except when the foe was white. And so, yeah, so I think that's what makes it so, that's what the heart of the critique is, right? Or not even critique, the backlash, right? That she deigned to expose that violence in the home. But the other thing too that you brought up, I'm so glad you brought up Scheherazade, because sisterhood is the other theme that I saw kind of everywhere in this book. And sisterhood is lived experience, right? The experience of Celie and Nettie and you and your sister. but also as praxis, right? This beautiful sisterhood between Alice and Gloria and Beverly. And then of course with Micheline that comes into that, right? And then also as an ethic, I think about Sophia and how beautifully you just rendered, again, you showed really the evolution of how you identified with Sophia. And so I wanted you to also just talk a little bit more about how that ethic of sisterhood is as praxis and as an ethic, and obviously as a thematic that we see in The Color Purple, but that is all over. It's really the imprint of this book as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a basis of our friendships. You're the, youngest of four, right? So you come from sisters, and so sometimes I think when people are close to their sisters, it just makes them more open to the possibility of inviting other women into their life intimately, without a sense of competition and without a sense of of suspicion, right? And so thank you for being a sister to me in so many ways. Yeah. But I think, and I've been quoting this, but you're the expert francophone scholar, and so I've always been struck by the French kind of democratic ethos of liberté, égalité, fraternité, right? And so there's a way in which brotherhood is seen as a kind of way of imagining a common civic society. It's a basis of solidarity and a basis of community. And I find sisterhood to be such a radical practice of being able to accept difference and sameness at once, right? And so I've been using this example of Venus and Serena when they first played against each other at the US Open. And what a remarkable, I don't know if you remember, but Zena Garrison was there and Dionne Warwick, they were like praying for them. It was like such a humongous moment. And what the prayers were for was to bless these two young women, teenage girls. They were teenage girls, to bless them because there was something higher than the competition that they were involved in. And so I think of them as just such an amazing model of wanting the other person to be their best self, and you still maintaining a sense of difference, right? And so sisterhood to me, it just provides a model of how democratic society can really flourish if we allow it and we see it. And then sisterhood's the model for our work at A Long Walk Home in terms of what feminist practice really looks like. How do you not only want what's best for yourself, but you want what's best for that other person next to you, and you will do whatever you can to make sure that their rights are protected. It's just a basis of Black women are like, this is how we sister in the movie, right? With Suge, but sisters is how we refer to each other. I think we understand through having to have these kind of alternative family structures as a result of slavery on one hand, but also inherited in some ways from the old world. Sisterhood is really a dynamic at its best that can provide a lot of freedom and flexibility to who we are. So Alice Walker, I think, kind of gets to that, because it's not just like, as you point out, Nettie and Celia are the two sisters that are the writers. They're writing letters across the ocean to each other in the novel, but Sophia is part of this sisterhood. Right. And then Squeak is part of that. It's an extended way. And then Suge and Celia are obviously partners and lovers, but Suge and Squeak and Suge and Sophia, it's this really beautiful community that then becomes it makes it possible for Harpo to heal and Albert to heal. And so I think that's the kind of beauty that Alice is trying to show us here with sisterhood.
Yeah, that's true. It's funny that you brought up the French, because I remember a couple of weeks ago, I was texting you and your sister and telling you that in French, the word for soulmate is âme sœur, right? So it's like the soul sister, which, I think there are lots of things that the French language gets wrong, but that was one where I was like, oh, that makes so much sense, because I think that idea of sisterhood and soulmates. And also, the sisterhood is even larger. I knew about Gloria Steinem and Alice Walker. I knew about Beverly Guy Cheptel, but when you describe how Shirley Chisholm defended the book and how Maxine Waters did, I was like, oh my gosh, like I just saw this, like the Dora Milaje, right, coming out for Alice to really, defend her in the midst of all that backlash, which was a story that we didn't know beforehand.
Yeah, I was so excited to find that in the archive. You know,
Yeah.
that's part of the joy of the archive. And also like her relationship with June Jordan.
Yes.
She's writing her so much. She sends a early version to Audre Lorde. I was just so excited to find these other women in the archive. Like you said, Maxine Waters and Shirley Chisholm, like supporting her, hosting screening parties, right, of the movie. It kind of blew me away. I had to figure out how to get them in. And also I had to figure out how to get the everyday Black woman in who
Yeah.
also saw themselves in the movie, right? To balance that. So
Exactly. Yeah, you really did a great job of doing both of those. I had no idea that they were in a group called the Sisterhood in New York City. I didn't know anything about that.
Yeah. I mean, I have a very good former student. She's a professor now at Michigan, Sarah Ellen Strongman. So she's been writing about the Sisterhood. Yeah, it's beautiful. And I had a friend, Dara, who, you know, Cook sent me the picture of the Sisterhood today. And she was just so excited. There's a famous picture of the group, and Bessie Smith is on the wall. I picture Bessie Smith behind them. And you have people like Morrison and Shange. I mean, it's just amazing. And Alice Walker, and, you know, kind of like the collectives that you've created or that we've all been part of that sustain you. These are the women on the verge of becoming canons, you know, canonical figures. They're gathering, and they're meeting in New York, and they're highly critical. They're trying to figure out, like, they're strategizing. How do I get you in Essence, and how do we get you in the Times, and should we create our own press? And, you know, it's pretty amazing what they were doing. So yeah. Sisterhood. Yeah.
They have a plan. So the other theme that I saw also, and that I haven't, you know, I've been trying to go to all of your different book talks, and I haven't heard a lot of.
Oh, you're so nice. You're so sweet.
Well, I just wanted to make sure. I was like, what can I ask her that other people haven't asked?
Oh, you're true academic. You're doing your research. Thank you. Thank you.
Competitive, but the spirituality piece, right? So thinking about, and again, I know, going back to Story of a Rape Survivor and A Long Walk Home, and how I know, you know, I think about, I hear Scheherazad's voice in my head, like, how has spirituality affected your journey? And spirituality is such a big piece of who Alice is, right? And who you are, and what we see in The Color Purple. And so I wanted you to thread that needle for us, just to talk about the different influences of spirituality. I see it in the book, like, you talk about pilgrimage a lot and rites of passage. You talk about your own spiritual practices. And Alice's, but I wanted you to just flesh that out more for us, for those who haven't had the pleasure of reading the book yet. Too.
Yeah, I'm looking for this quote from Alice, and her disappointment that people do not. Okay, so here's, it's on page 14. So she says, my novel, The Color Purple, was actually my Buddhist novel, but without Buddhism. Mm-hmm. In the face of unbearable suffering following the assassinations and betrayals of the civil rights movement, I too sat down upon the earth and asked his permission to posit a different way from that in which I was raised. Unlike Ward's Chapel, the African Methodist Episcopal Church in which Walker grew up, her novel explored a viable alternative to Christian dogma, nature. In the preface to the 25th anniversary edition, Walker wrote, "It's no mystery how and at what point in time African Americans, like the characters in this novel, began believing in a God designed to guide and further their desires of another people, of a God who thought of Blackness as a curse." And then she goes on later to say about Celie, everything that happens during her life spanning decades is in relation to her growth in understanding this force. And yet, despite the centrality of spirituality in The Color Purple, Walker, 25 years after the book was first published, was left to query why the novel is, quote, so infrequently discussed as a book about God, end quote. And I just thought that was just so interesting to read, because it's not something I don't know how when you teach the book, but when I teach the book, I don't often talk about the spiritual ethos of it. I talk about sisterhood, I talk about trauma, talk about language, but I don't always talk about the spirit. And so I think for me, when I went to Alice's hometown of Eatonton, Georgia, which is where The Color Purple is based, and you see that she's, you know, on the one street in which she was raised, there's her church, and then there's a graveyard with her family. And that triangulation of life, of afterlife, of God, all of that at once kind of gave me insights into how or what she was trying to infuse throughout this book. And then when you leave Eatonton, and it's gorgeous. That was the other thing. It was like, oh, you kind of have to go, you think of Eatonton as this place of like deep trauma for Alice, right? It was Jim Crow segregation. And you think about it as a site of psychological and physical harm for many of the Black women that she writes about, and some of the Black men that she writes about. And then you go and it's gorgeous. And then you realize that she tries to replicate that without the segregation, of course, is what she would say, in Northern California. And when I was able to go to her house in Northern California, I was able to see what like this relationship to the land and to nature is so true and so part of her commitment to the world, and that it's born in Georgia, and that to grow up on the land in Eatonton gave her vocabulary and insight that didn't have until I went there myself. And so I guess that's part of the journey of spirituality in the book, that Celie's relationship. And she ends the book, she starts the book, Dear God, and Celie ends with Dear all of these things, and ends with God again. Dear the sun, the moon, the stars, and then God again, right? And so God is in everyone and everything. Right. It's such a miracle to explore in the novel. And then I think on my own journey of healing, as you know, redefining my relationship to spirituality was central to my healing. And so I don't know, I mean, it's an ongoing journey, but I think what this book, I guess, which I haven't said in any conversations, what The Color Purple, writing this book has given me is a deeper understanding of how forces around me or in me shape my life as a writer. And so I think I have to, like, I just have to have things that connect me, like jewelry and beads and candles. Every time I do these book talks, I have to touch other parts of the universe that aren't simply the pages of my book, I guess. So.
That's so beautiful. That makes me think also about Shangé, right? I found God in myself and I loved her fiercely, and this idea of like this communion, right? Creating that. It's also fascinating to me because an entire school of Black theology was founded based on Alice Walker, right? So thinking about womanist theology.
Yeah.
So Katie Cannon says that it's actually specifically not just Alice Walker's term womanism, but those novels, her novels, The Color Purple, that allowed her, that was the point of departure for thinking about Black women's lived experience, to tell us about the spirit world, to tell us about religion, to tell us about spirituality. So it's really fascinating I wonder, like, I want to know what Alice thinks about womanist theology. You can ask her next time.
Yeah, that'd be good. Yeah, you can ask her next time you talk to her.
Okay, so I have to open it for questions in about 8 minutes, but I do have 2 questions I want to make sure I get to. So maybe I can combine them. All right, so thinking about restorative justice, right? Again, so much of, I think, your evolution in the book, also as a writer, as a thinker, as an activist, as a feminist, is also about your different, I love the metaphor of the mirrors that you use, right? The different ways that you're able to look and see. And so, you recently published that article in the New York Times, Can an Abuser Make Amends? The Color Purple Points the Way, which was beautiful. And I didn't realize at the time when I read it, how much of an extension it was of also, this book. And I heard you talking to Tarana about it the other day, and it was so sweet when you talked about Alice's response. But I want you to talk about that, but I also want us to just think together about restorative justice in relation to Me Too. And really, she was prophetic, right? What Alice Walker was doing is she was envisioning a world for survivors that, we haven't really fully seen. So it's the world that you and I dream of seeing eventually. But that vision is so important. Can you talk about restorative justice in this book, and how your ideas about the book were influenced by this redemptive vision of seeing Albert as a redemptive figure, which also goes back to what you read in the beginning.
Yeah, and I think, with her very first novel, The Third Life of Grange Copeland, which is based again on her grandfather, that Alice gives us, his third life is his relationship with his granddaughter. He's an abusive man. He's also a victim of deep racism in the South. And his son ends up shooting his wife in front of this character Ruth, who's he ends up shooting his wife in the novel in front of the daughter, who's ends up being the granddaughter, right? So, and the book is about Grange's path to becoming a man, path to becoming whole, and it's all tied to this granddaughter. And so what's so interesting, if you just read her work, and obviously I focus primarily on everything before The Color Purple, and then including The Color Purple, you see that she is consistently working through those themes in her novels and in her poetry and her short stories. But really, I'm going to focus on novels with The Third Life of Grange Copeland, Meridian, and The Color Purple. I mean, and it's like, where does that come from? That ability to want and hope for characters who do such harm to each other to find a way through and a way out with each other is so breathtaking. And so I guess that's part of what I didn't realize I was attracted to when I read the novel. You know, my story of reading the novel is I read 3 books at the same time, as you know, The Color Purple, The Bluest Eye, and Malcolm X's autobiography. And those shape my trajectory forever. But in The Color Purple, I found a book that I still haven't, I don't know if you, I mean, maybe there are other works that you feel like do this, but it's such a tender portrayal of forgiveness, and also such a radical portrayal of wanting to be forgiven. Because I think we've seen things where people have the capacity to forgive, but rarely have we seen works in which a character tries so hard to be forgiven. And I find that to be, I don't know, I mean, you know, I just find it to be actually so beautiful and breathtaking. And yeah, you're right, she's prophetic then. I still think she's prophetic now. And why so few people are interested in atoning or amending, we can kind of talk about. It also relates to my book, Sites of Slavery, as you know. The last chapter in that book is about reparations. And so I think it's just a theme that I'm interested in. How do people, I don't know, like make up for their sins? Like, how do people, and not just make up for their sins, but how do they give the people that they've harmed, I don't know, how do they connect to them, but also how do they restore and pay amends? Like, that to me is really, as a nation, how do we do that with Black people? And as individuals, how do we do that with the people that we've harmed? I mean, that's something I think, because I'm a survivor, I'm really constantly interrogating and really interested in.
Yeah, I love that so much. I have like 72 comments. It makes me think of the more I wonder, the more I love, right? Because it's like that love that you're seeing is because she's trying to figure that out. She's wondering about it. I think someone that I think thinks about this a lot too is Edwidge Danticat in The Dew Breaker. Differently. Okay, so the last question before I open it up is about freedom, and this is another, you know, theme that I've seen and something I love to think about and talk about. You say on page 7, I realized Alice Walker is the freest Black woman I'd ever met, and I love that because it makes me think about all the work that you do around freedom. You know, we think about the Black Girls Freedom Fund, and just the vision that we have, right, as activists and as people that believe in abolition. Like, freedom is the goal, right? But I want to know why. Why is Alice Walker the freest woman that you've ever met? And how do we achieve that? How do we get that? Achieve that for Black women and girls, right? Can we bottle it up?
Part of it's a writerly trick, right? I'm trying to introduce how she's not Zora Neale Hurston in a sense, but I'm trying to introduce Janie. And so in that moment, I'm trying to paint a lineage or a genealogy of Alice and Zora. And I say that Zora only because Zora dies in obscurity and Alice lives with an extensive archive. But and then also, as we know, Alice was really a significant person to revive Zora Neale Hurston in the 1970s for a new audience of readers. So there's that part of me like trying to like play it out for you so you know where I fit into this story. But also I just think that she's earned the right to not care. And so I think part of what the book is exploring is you have this Black woman who writes this novel who are based on family members. And I think no one was prepared for the backlash. No one was prepared for the picketing, the calls for boycotts, the bans, the comparing to Birth of a Nation, the comparing it to being a Nazi, Holocaust kind of like it's as racist as Nazis were to Jewish people. No one's prepared for that kind of venom directed towards her with The Color Purple. And so I think what that process goes through, Beverly says she was the most hated Black woman in America at the time of The Color Purples, especially the movie.
Ever.
And so, ever. I'm always very clear about that. So I think, yeah, I was interested. You see her, and she's on the top of this mountain, and she's gone through so many different public and private traumas. But she's earned the right to not care in a particular, and yet she's so compassionate, right? So there's that. But yeah, and I was like trying to, like, I had so many emotions when I met her, so I was trying to appear detached, but also, I don't know, I had a lot of things. So I realized that she wasn't performing for me. I was trying to do multiple performances for her, and I realized like that wasn't necessary either. So yeah, it was nice.
I have so much to say about that, but we're gonna move to the question.
Okay.
Oh,
this is so nice. That, we're just talking to each other. I mean, I know there are people there, but it just feels.
Okay, so this one, I think I know. Yeah. So, okay, the question was: are there books that you typically teach alongside The Color Purple, or that you believe complement the themes of the text? So,
yeah. So I usually teach it in converse. So I start with "Their Eyes Were Watching God" by Zora Neale Hurston, Toni Morrison Sula. Then I teach The Color Purple, and then I teach Janet Mock's Redefining Realness. Janet, she also blurbs my book, which I was really honored by, but she mirrors her book, Redefining Realness, off of Their Eyes Were Watching God, in terms of the 3-part structure of Janie's partners. And so I just like thinking about how Black womanhood, Black women's sexuality, Black female friendship changes over time if you put these 4 books together. So
excellent.
Yes, this is my answer.
My feminism class is very similar, but I throw in For Color Girls in there too.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah. So
I'm also a student of Skip Gates, is obviously who at Harvard. So Zora and Signifying Monkey also shaped how I think about the relationship or the tradition, so to speak, of Walker and Hurston.
Right, exactly. Which you read about really beautifully too. Okay, so this question comes from.
And it was nice finding a young Skip Gates. Like in the archives, you find like a young Skip Gates writing Alice Walker, a young professor. You find Elizabeth Alexander, didn't make it to my book, but Elizabeth Alexander writes Alice Walker about the book. It's so nice. It's just like, people wrote letters. I mean, we write emails now, but people wrote letters effusive about a book.
Are there any versions of do you have like the marked up manuscript that June Jordan read, for example? Is that in the archive? I'm sure Alice has it.
No, just the letters. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, so we have a question from someone by the name of Tracy Curry, who wants you to talk more about your reaction.
Who's that?
The photo. Your reaction to finding the photo of Rachel. She was so struck, as you were, by seeing this woman who was the inspiration for Celie, realizing that she had misunderstood and misread her through the eyes of characters who didn't really see her, rather than seeing who she truly is.
Well, thank you, Tracy, Ms. Curry, who's an inspiration to many of us, as well, with her work in film and her prior work in television. So another Black feminist doing good work in the world. So when Shahrazad and I are at Alice's house, and she's describing Rachel, who is her grandmother, her step-grandmother, but her grandmother, whom she bases Celie on, she's describing her, and she's concerned that people always, like the actors who play Celie, particularly maybe Cynthia Erivo, feel like there's this weight of ugliness put on them. And so she literally writes a poem to Cynthia Erivo about Celie's beauty. And so I asked her about that, and she's just like, it was always so painful for her that people believe, she says, what Pa, who's her Celie's stepfather, believes his version of her.
Despite
and so she
puts her at the center, right? Like she centers her, but
yeah, she's like, why don't readers believe that she's as beautiful as Nettie? And you're like, oh, and we're like listening to her. I'm like, yeah, like why don't And then she's like, she was gorgeous. I was like, yeah, sure, I'm sure she's gorgeous. Like she's your grandmother. And then Alice is like trying to find a picture of her, and she just can't. And she's like, the next day we go back, she hasn't found this picture, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, but it just seemed to me that if I could find this picture, that it would do certain work. So I go back to, so months later, I'm in town in Atlanta for the national, well, Alice is also a keynote. She's on stage with Beverly, but I have to go to this archive at Emory. I have a panel on sexual assault, the Black women's organizing. I almost missed, yeah, I'm like 5 minutes late for my panel because I'm at this Emory archive trying to find this picture of Rachel. And so I find this picture of these 4 Black women. One of them's named Rachel. I'm like, well, maybe, who could it be her? And so, but I still don't know which one is, these. So then I send the picture to Alice on my phone, and she's like, oh, that's my mom. That's my maternal grandmother, Nettie. Her mother's name, Minnie Lou, I think. Minnie, her mother, her maternal grandmother, her family friend, and then Rachel. And Rachel looks like, to me, a bit like Josephine Baker. And so Alice says, you see, she was the prettiest of them all. But no one could see it then. And so it was kind of a revelation of my own bias as a reader, as a viewer, that I believe to Pa's negation of Seeley. So it was a really revelatory moment for me.
I love that, Salamishah, too, because that goes back to the journey and the evolution that I'm talking about. You write with such vulnerability and transparency about things that you may have gotten wrong, what your own blind spots are. I love the way you talk about Micheline and how Micheline kind of opens the world to you for how she sees things. And you say, like, yeah, I hadn't developed my Black feminist consciousness yet. I really love the way that you chart that journey.
Yeah, it was like homophobic. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's important to admit those things, because we aren't, even with this book on Nina Simone, it's like, it's almost as if you always were the thing you are now. And like, no, like we actually have to become these people. My politics weren't always what they are. They clearly were shaped in many ways the way that I had a foundation. I probably was always like on the right path, but I had shortcomings. And so, yeah, that's how growth happens, I think.
Exactly. And I think it's so important for our students too to see, like, I think about young people reading this. Okay, more questions, sorry. Okay, so Dr. Rhonda Frederick has a question or slash.
Oh, this is like a family reunion.
Justice, I know. It's just the people that we know that aren't anonymous, which is funny. Like everyone else is anonymous.
Oh, okay.
It says, with regard to restorative justice, I May Destroy You, which I, Régine, know that you have written about also, represented the kind of restorative justice for self while de-emphasizing the outcome for the perpetrator. And so I wonder if you could talk about I May Destroy You in relation to the question of restorative justice and redemption and portrayal of a rape survivor, even, right?
Yeah, and I mentioned that in the Color Purple article that you cited earlier. And I love I May Destroy You. I was blown away by that finale and the multiple endings that she imagined. I think lots of rape survivors have gone through each of those scenarios, either try to at least get some form of legal justice, but have imagined killing the person, have imagined loving the person. And then ultimately, I May Destroy You is another way of thinking of the role of art as the thing that comes about in lieu of justice. And I guess this is what I was thinking about with my other book, Sites of Slavery, when I end that chapter of reparations. I think I end the book with the Toni Morrison quote about because there were no skyscrapers and monuments, there's not a bench by the road, there was not a tree scored to represent the lives of those who had lived as enslaved Black people in America. The novel had to. And so I think as a child of those writers and as a survivor and as a Black person in the New World, right, a descendant of enslaved people in the Caribbean and in the United States, I think we are always trying to imagine what justice looks like, because so many of the institutions that we are part of and that we by birthright should be protected by and have access to deny us our full humanity and our full freedom. We've created all these other ways of doing it. And so I think I May Destroy You is pretty astonishing in how clear it was that Arabella's book and her journey to self was in some ways not, and it wasn't everything, but it was the beginning of something that was enough for her. And I just thought that was so astonishing. I mean, it was so breathtaking, and I completely understood. So yeah, and I think you see some of the restorative justice stuff there, not with the person who rapes her, that's the catalyst for the show, but with the author that sexually assaults her, who eventually helps her figure out what the novel or the book or the memoir is going to be. So
Yeah, yeah.
thank you
Oh,
for that question.
I have more comments, but I'm going to give you this anonymous attendee since I can talk to you later. This person wants to know, and it actually relates. Do you feel that you have forgiven your perpetrators? I get intellectually why this is important for self, but the reality seems unattainable.
Yeah, I don't know if I have. I'm not silly. Like I don't think I don't. No, I don't think I've forgiven them. I don't know if that's a strong suit of mine. You're a good friend of mine. I'm a compassionate and empathetic person, but I feel like I've forgiven myself, and maybe that's on the journey to forgiving others. But I think I spent a lot of time feeling so ashamed and blaming myself for my experiences with sexual assault, that so much of my work has been about forgiving myself. And then in a way, the lives of other people who harm me, you have to just, that life will happen to them as it happens to them. But my role on this earth is to make sure that this doesn't happen to others. And if it does happen to other people, that I help them know that they have the right to feel whole. They have the right to trust in themselves again. They have the right to be seen and be believed and love themselves fully. So that's what I feel like my purpose is on this earth. I also have little kids. I have an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. I can hear them. I don't know if you all can hear them. I can hear them in the background.
Tell them Auntie Régine says hi. And the thing is also, just for that person who asked, this distinction between what we're talking about when we talk about restorative justice is, in restorative justice, the perpetrator asks, right? The perpetrator has to be willing to go through that process versus, the people that raped you, like they haven't come forward to ask.
Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah.
restorative justice and forgiveness in the same. I just didn't want to miss that point. But we only
No, thank you. Because I think there's a lot of pressure for women to jump to restorative justice when people are not going through the process of atonement. And I think those conversations are happening in particular spaces around racial justice and Black unity that still deny the fact that people have to acknowledge that they have committed this harm. I do think there are other models, and particularly Indigenous communities, that have been practicing restorative justice, and the idea of exile is on the table, right? Like that there are just different. Well, so I think, and it's interesting because I feel like Shahrazad and Alawak is in coalition work with Indigenous women in Minnesota around missing and murdered Indigenous women and missing and murdered Black women. And I was able to participate this year because it was virtually, and just the level of sophistication, again, this question of home, but like state violence and gender-based violence and violence against the land, these three things. And how does one navigate and negotiate? I feel like we have a lot to learn about restorative justice from our Indigenous brothers and sisters.
Agreed, 100%. Okay, this will be the last question. This person wants to know, what was Alice Walker's response to your book? Did you ask her permission with respect to the title? But I know.
No, the title was me. It comes from In Search of Our Mother's Garden. I chose that title for a number of reasons. It's funny, my editor, Jameson, he's such a lovely person. And that was like the title I suggested on my proposal. And he really liked it. I was like, I'm going to change it. Don't worry. He's like, no, I think it's great. And I was like, okay. So one, it comes from In Search of Our Mother's Garden. And that book is important for my book for two reasons. One, that's where Alice writes about she calls it the gem of the idea, the germ of the idea of the story. She has an essay. Her sister and her are walking, and they start talking about, right? And so that was important. Like, that's where she tells the story of how The Color Purple begins. She reprints her essay looking for Zora in that she wrote in Ms. And then I write my introduction looking for Alice in the beginning. And then the other reason, it's her first creative nonfiction work. And so, and that's the first book after The Color Purple. So after The Color Purple is born, if you go to the archives, The Color Purple's done, she's writing these essays, she's talking to her editor about this. And I thought that was such a So that's book. That's where the title comes from. So I'm a literary critic like you, Régine. So we're always thinking about tradition and mirrors and intertextuality. And then Alice did read my book. She read the version before I sent it for final edits, and she was, I was like terrified. Now again, another sisterly moment. Valerie Boyd, who is the writer of the Hurston biography, who's become a good friend of mine through Beverly, and also she's the editor of Alice's forthcoming journals that are going to be coming out. Valerie was like, "Don't worry, Salamishah, I understand you're nervous, but it will be okay." And she gave me an example of a scenario where her heart like leapt and she was so nervous. And so Alice read it. She gave me comments. She sent back a manuscript with notes.
I remember.
Yeah, and she's so generous because like basically her stuff was like tonal things here, some factual things there, and then she read the book, and she sent me a really kind note. She reads things twice, as you can tell. So she needs to see the movie twice. She needs to watch the musical twice before she likes it. So I got the second read. So it's really kind of astonishing.
You did better than the musical. I think so.
Huh?
I said, I think you did better than the musical. The way you narrated that was perfect. Also, just that she goes home and then she comes back and she's like, okay.
Oh yeah, but I like the second musical a lot. That's what I really am a fan of it. And now they're doing the movie, so that's going to be its own life.
Yeah,
the movie of the musical.
That's gonna be interesting. Yeah, that's a thing now. That's a thing now. Oh, we're out of time. Someone wanted to know what you thought about the movie. We had that clip that Farah sent us earlier today. Remember about forgiveness and Oprah? Someone had a question about that. So, but it's okay.
So yeah, so much this book, Oprah. They can tweet me or tweet me is good. Yeah.
I want to say thank you. At one point, I think it's Beverly talking about Alice, and she talks about her preoccupation with the souls of Black women and girls. And that's exactly what I see at work in your life, whether you are writing for the New York Times, whether you're teaching, doing your activist work for Long Uncle, whether you're parenting. And so I just, as a friend, I just appreciate that about you so much. And thank you for the way that you bring out those souls of so many different Black women in this book. So thank you, and congratulations.
It's a high compliment. When I read that line, I was like, I want that to be my legacy too. So thank you. It was just a beautiful one. I think we're wrapping up. I think I heard another voice.
We are wrapping up. Régine, Salamishah, this has been such a wonderful talk. Thank you both. This was just really lovely to hear and just a lovely place to learn. You're both such eloquent speakers, and it's lovely just to have two friends who are brilliant scholars talk to us as well. I have been enjoying this thoroughly. Thank you to everyone at home who's been tuning in tonight and showing up for authors, publishers, indie book selling, and the incredible staff at Harvard Bookstore. If you would like to read this book, please shop indie and shop local. We have links in the chat if you would like a copy, if you would like to support Salamishah and her work. And thank you again for tuning in. Have a great night from all of us at Harvard Bookstore. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you to her.
Bye.